he seemed to have a very, very important role. And I said, how do you get a job like that? And he said, well, I was briefed every day for months in an underground facility in West Virginia. And I used to cry myself to sleep every night.
The first time you told me that, cry myself to sleep every night, it freaks me out today. I still get goosebumps. I'm Bryce Zabel. Have you ever wondered if there's a secret connection between Hollywood and UFOs?
I'm Brent Friedman, and you are listening to Sound, Light, and Frequency.
This is the episode where we discuss a crazy UFO movie you probably never heard of. But strangely, this one aligns with modern ufology big time.
And I'm going to tell you about the family friend in the Reagan administration who disclosed to me that aliens were real, and he'd seen them.
You and I had the experience, I was going to say the good experience, but it was just an experience where we sat down and watched Hangar 18 together. That's not something we've done often or more than that one time, but we decided to do it because we think it's kind of an important linchpin in the whole UFO Hollywood kind of tale. And just to set this up, we had Close Encounters in 1977 coming out. And in 1980, you had Spielberg's special edition of it. So that's the same year as Hangar 18. Hangar 18 happens to be a film that didn't do great in the theaters, but I remember seeing it because it was on either late night television or cable or something. And it just has a lot of ufological things in it, probably some that are a little more on target with what people think today than even what Spielberg did.
Well, so agreed. I think I was shocked by the plot of it, how ambitious it was in many ways. Let's talk a little bit about what was the plot, because it's a little hard to summarize.
Well, we did work out a little log line here. I'll read that for everyone. After a UFO collides with a satellite and crashes to the Earth, two astronauts must defy a government cover-up to expose the truth behind the mysteries at Hangar 18. Sounds a lot better than the movie was, to be honest with you.
Well, and to be fair, the movie was clearly low budget. It didn't have a lot of big names in it, and it certainly didn't have the visionary director like Steven Spielberg. All of that said, I think the thing that really intrigued me was when you look at what it was introducing in terms of new ideas to ufology, a lot of those hold up under more scrutiny today, I would argue, than Close Encounters. So for instance, they had a captured craft at a secret base. They had humanoid aliens, not our gray space brothers. They had the concept of ancient aliens shaping our history. Now, to be fair, there was another movie, Galactica in 1980, that was about ancient astronauts. And at this point, Chariots of the Gods had already been out there. So this wasn't an idea that was new to Hangar 18, but they put it in and they wove it into the plot in ways that I thought were really fascinating.
It seems like Hangar 18 had a lot of big ideas and a very small budget, which I'm familiar with because, as you know, my film Official Denial had a really big idea or two behind it. And then they cast a 12-year-old ballerina to play the alien, and the rest is history. Listen, Hangar 18 is the most chock full of ufological references since Close Encounters. And they're crazier, and the budget is low, and there's really zero reality to the way it's portrayed on screen. But if you take a step back and ask yourself, what are they actually saying here? They're saying in this film that these aliens had been here before. They've come back. They are surveying our nuclear sites. They're surveying our power stations. They're surveying our military. Does that sound familiar, by the way?
This sounds like it was made in 2020.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's the thing, as compromised as the movie is from a production standpoint. I mean, honestly, as I was watching it, it made me wonder, was My guy in the Reagan administration, John Herrington, was he shown Hangar 18 as part of his debrief?
I'm just trying to imagine a guy being debriefed in Washington, D.C. He was just sort of showing up there. He's a member of Reagan's kitchen cabinet, which you'll be getting into more later. And it's nighttime and they say, enough briefings about aliens today. Let's all just watch a movie together.
Right.
And up comes Hangar 18, which would be kind of mind-blowing. The other thing, by the way, about Hangar 18, for people that have ever seen Capricorn 1 with the astronauts on the run in the desert pursued by killers who may or may not be from NASA in Capricorn 1, NASA's got a big role in this movie too.
Yes. Yep.
The idea that, how would you describe the NASA role? They seem to be working with them.
It was a part of the cover-up, I think, is, again, and that's a lot of people believe that to be true today. So there were some really bold ideas, but I think let's take a detour now from Hangar 18.
Let me throw one thing in before we detour.
Yes.
There is some historical reference. I get hung up on trash talking the movie, which I'm not saying everyone should run out and watch it anyway, but it is historically interesting. It's also a Megadeth song, but I don't think that matters right now. The thing that does matter is that Leonard Stringfield, who was a very important guy and wrote numerous books and researched all his life basically into crash wreckage. And when he was actually writing these books, people acted like he was insane. Crash wreckage? Why write a book about that? There couldn't have been any, but if there was one, there can't be 50. And yet he was writing about these things. And it turns out Leonard Stringfield may not have been as crazy as people were trying to say he was. So tip of the hat to Leonard Stringfield, because he's the guy that introduced Hangar 18 in a regular, sustained way. He said that it was a place where they took the Roswell wreckage in 1947 to Wright-Patterson, where a lot of it ended up there, and that it was called Hangar 18.
Yes.
Now, I don't know if there's ever been a real Hangar 18 at Wright-Patterson. I don't think so.
Well, again, this is another case of if you go online, there's a lot of people that have devoted a lot of time and energy into investigating Hangar 18, and a lot of people believe it to be true.
Yeah.
Is it? Can't say.
It is interesting, though, and let's just give it its due. This movie managed to sort of change the dialogue again, because I think a lot of people saw it not in the theaters. I think a lot of people saw it because it was this low-budget thing that you could watch for free. And I remember watching it, and I can't say I loved it, but I was so starved for something to follow up Close Encounters, something that had UFOs in it and some of this rich UFO history. At least it gave that. I probably watched it at 3 a.m, and I might have been stoned when I did. So maybe that's why I liked it. I don't remember.
Yes. I wish I had been stoned when we watched it.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on.
Back to our detour. The story I'm about to tell you, I've only told twice on camera. Once, a very truncated version for our Dark Skies extras for the DVD release. And then, interestingly, the other time was with Bryce's former partner on Need to Know, Ross Coulthart. He did an interview with me, which has never aired. Now, here's the thing about this story. There's obvious risks about telling this story. It involves someone very high up and high level in government who happens to still be alive. But I've got to say something on a personal note. A couple years ago, something happened to me that convinced me that I needed to go public in a much bigger way with this story. I'm not going to go into the whole recap, but 4 years ago, I had cancer and I almost died. I was literally on my deathbed. Ironically, from a complication in my recovery, I developed sepsis almost a year to the date that my father had died of sepsis in a hospital. And so there I was during COVID. No one could come and visit me. I was in an ICU. My temperature was 105.5. And as I felt myself slipping away, I saw light beings come to the foot of my bed. I'm talking light beings like we saw at the end of Contact, right? And they were formless. I didn't know who they were. I didn't recognize them as relatives or anyone I was connected to, but I felt a sense of relief. I felt a sense of all I had to do was in my mind say, I'm ready. but I wasn't ready. And I don't even know if I could articulate why I wasn't ready, but I felt I had more to do. Well, cut to months later when I was actually onto my recovery and doing much better, my family said something to me which really, it stuck with me. And they said, there was a point when we thought we were going to lose you, and we were going to lose all of these stories you've told us growing up. And it reminded me of that moment in one of my favorite movies, Blade Runner. All of those memories were going to be lost like tears in rain. And I thought, you know what? I have to tell this story. And that is partly why when Bryce and I started talking about this podcast, I felt emboldened that this was the time, this was the place. This may be the reason that I didn't check out, right? Or at least one of them.
I didn't want to interrupt you there because that's very personal. And I didn't know you were going to bring that up. I didn't really experience that with you, although I knew about it, and it couldn't have been a good thing. And I'm very sorry you had to go through that, and we can talk more about that off camera, I guess. But in the context of this, I'm sort of glad that you took out of that experience that it's time to give voice to some of these things. And partly that's because if any of us have anything we need to do, it's to bear witness. You are bearing witness to something that happened that years from now, even when they are writing the story of why did it take so long for humans to wake up to this reality, and why did they make this thing about secrecy, and why were they doing all this? This is an important part of that. So I'm glad that you're telling it here, and I'm glad you're telling it in the full form, and that you are bearing witness. And all I can say really is that I've heard you tell this story before, and I always wanted you to tell it in a larger form. I wasn't wild about telling it to Ross at that time, because I thought, this is just going to become an ephemeral piece of TV news business. Nothing against Ross. I'm just saying that's how News Nation would have treated it. And I think that what you're about to do here is a qualitative difference. You're going to go deep. You're not going to, other than me, you won't be interrupted, I don't think. And I want you to go ahead and do that. But let's remember, it's 1981 when this happens, just so we're all clear on it. It's the summer of 1981, and your neighbor is part of Reagan's inner circle. And I'll that you're teed up. Go.
Yes. So just to give a little bit more context, this was a man, a family that I grew up next door to from the age of about 5 to 12. He has 2 daughters that were a little younger than me. And my father was an artist growing up, very introverted. And this man, John Herrington, was very much a man's man. He was the one that taught me how to throw a football and how to hit a baseball and all of these boy things, right? And I remember watching football games with him in his living room. He was a huge Washington Redskins fan, which made me, little competitive kid, want to be a Dallas Cowboys fan. And I still am a Dallas Cowboys fan. And so I had this really wonderful relationship with him. And when we moved away when I was 12, we still stayed very close with the family. Cut to the summer after I graduated from high school. We hadn't heard from him in a while, although my parents had told me that he had gotten some job in the government and his family had moved back east. So during the summer of 1981, between going to high school and when I ultimately went to UCLA that fall, I got a phone call from him. And he said, "Hey, Brent, I've moved the family back east, and how'd you like to make some money?" I said, "Well, great. What's the job?" And he said, "Well, we still have our house in the Bay Area, and I'd like you to get a couple friends and drive our 2 cars and our dog across the country. And if you do that, I'm going to pay you X amount of dollars, and I'll take you around. I'll take you into the White House. I'll show you around, and then I'll fly you guys back home, right? What do you think?" How could I not do that deal?
That sounds like the greatest deal on earth for an 18-year-old.
Right. And there's a whole story that I won't be telling on this podcast about that road trip, which I'm surprised that I'm still alive. But here's the thing. When we arrived at his house in Langley Farms, Virginia, back east, it was late at night. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have Google Maps. We didn't have any of that. And so by the time we got there, we misjudged how late we would get there. And it was 3:00 in the morning. And we didn't know what else to do. So we just parked these 2 cars with a dog and some other things they asked us to bring from the garage in front of this very nice house in Langley Farms. And we said, we'll just sleep off the rest of the night. And then about 10 minutes in, tap, tap, tap on the window. And there was some security guards pointing flashlights in. And they thought that we had just robbed somebody in the neighborhood.
And fallen asleep.
Right?
Bad
and so
robbers.
I try and explain, oh no, it's John Herrington. And so they have to go wake him up at 3:30 in the morning. He has to explain what's going on. He says, stay in the car, go back to, I'm not going to wake the rest of the family for this. Go back to bed. I'll see you tonight when I get back. All right. Cut to that night. I remember thinking, wow, I want to know what John is doing. Like what is his job now? Because again, no one in our family really knew. There'd been about a year or so before we had been contacted, I believe, by the NSA or the CIA or somebody that did some interviews with each of us about his character, right? Which was very strange, which I suppose was part of him getting this job.
And a security clearance.
And a security clearance,
yeah.
Yes, which I will get to in a second. That was quite impressive. So anyway, come dinner time, everyone's ready to have dinner. I've got these 2 friends with me who are very interested in the 2 daughters that I grew up with. And we're waiting for John to come home. And so I'm kind of pacing in the living room, like excited. I haven't seen him in years. And I see a black town car pull up out front. And he gets out with these 2 what look like Secret Service guys, and he's got a briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. And they walk him up to the front door and they escort him into his office right off the front door, where I'm kind of trying to take some of this in, peeking around the corner, and his briefcase goes into a wall safe, right? And one of the guys leaves and another person stays behind, and he comes out and greets me and says, oh, great, let's go have dinner. And I'm thinking, what is going on? Right? Remember, this is 1981, right? So I'm 18 years old. I don't know anything about politics or how government works other than what I learned in civics, which wasn't, I think I got like a C in civics. So I didn't really know much. This all just felt very strange to me. So I sit through dinner just like anxiously wanting to ask him all these questions. And afterwards, he kind of says, hey, Brent, let's let everyone else, go do their thing. You and I go out onto the back veranda and, let's have a conversation. Well, the first thing I noticed was that this was a guy who, when I was growing up, was, I believe, a strict Calvinist and didn't drink, didn't swear. And he actually took a bottle of Jim Beam with him out onto the veranda and was pouring him what I later heard from my parents called 2 fingers, just like a little tumbler glass, or just like little bits kept drinking it. And honestly, this guy was really super fit when I was growing up. He was, again, a real man's man. And it looked like he was heavier. He was haggard. He looked like he'd been through a lot. And this was only summer of 81. So he'd only been in the administration theoretically for 6-7 months, maybe.
Correct.
So, but it looked like he was wearing all of that stress on him.
I just want to stop you for one moment and say, we're going to take a break and we are going to come back now that you've teed up Mr. Herrington and a bottle of Jim Beam and an 18-year-old kid in the back patio. What could go wrong?
All right. We're back on the patio. Somebody's drinking. It's not me. And we start to talk, just catching up. He was giving me shit about going to UCLA instead of his alma mater, Stanford, which, by the way, apparently he went through Stanford in 3 years with a 4.0. That's the type of person we're talking about here. And he was a lawyer. He was a very successful lawyer in the Bay Area. So super smart guy. Anyway, we're talking. Once we get past all of the niceties, I say, so what is this job you have? Right? I tell him about how people came to our house and he apologizes. And I said, people arriving with a briefcase handcuffed to your wrist. What is going on? He said, well, I'm working at a very high level in the Reagan administration. And he had been the advance man for Reagan's campaign. So he and Reagan were quite close.
Am I correct in saying, though, that his actual job description at that time was the assistant to the undersecretary of the Navy?
I believe so, yes.
Okay.
He did have an official title. I know that at the time, he was working on something behind the scenes with the Abscam situation. But what he ends up telling me is that he has a very high-level position, and in fact, his clearance is higher than the president's. I didn't know that that was possible. I thought the president of the United States was in charge of everything and made all the decisions. I think, as we've come to learn,
Not always true.
Not always true, and thankfully so in some cases. But in this particular case, he seemed to have a very, very important role. And I said, how do you get a job like that? And he said, well, I was briefed every day for months in an underground facility in West Virginia. And, I used to cry myself to sleep every night.
Which, the first time you told me that, cry myself to sleep every night, it freaks me out today. Today, I still get goosebumps. And
yes.
The first time you ever told that to me, you were very specific. You said 8 weeks. Am I just imagining that?
No, it was months.
It was months.
It was months.
All
so
right.
At any rate, this is a situation where exactly your reaction, when he says he cried himself to sleep every night. Remember, the guy that I grew up with, Captain Kilgore in Apocalypse Now. It was Robert Duvall's character. It was a tough, tough man. So for him to cry once struck me as unbelievable. To cry every night. Obviously, I said, well, why would you cry every night? And he said, because this is not the world I thought I was bringing my daughters into. And that gave me a lot of pause, because he said it with a certain sadness and gravity that it suddenly made me question, well, what is this world that you brought your daughters into? And by the way, I'm kind of like a half son to you. And I said, well, what does that mean? He goes, look, this is all highly classified material. That's the nature of the job. I can't tell you any of those things. I said, yeah, but now my brain is going to go off into a million different directions. And he said, okay, all right, look, I know growing up you were into comic books and sci-fi and all that other stuff. I can tell you one thing. Aliens are here. They're real. And I've seen them.
Let's take a moment. Let's have a moment of silence. Okay. Okay. Continue.
Yes. Exactly. And he said it with such casualness that I didn't quite know how to respond. And all I could say was, wait, you've seen them? And he said, yes. And I said, and are they alive? He said, I can't say. You can't say or you won't say? I can't say. And that spun me off in a million different directions. And I thought, wait, okay, stop. If what you're saying is true, how is it that lots of people don't know this? And he said, oh, lots of people do know this. If you walk into any bookstore and you go to the UFO shelf, you're going to find lots of books that have a lot of truth in there. You know what else you're going to find? Books right next to them that have a lot of disinformation in them. We wrote those books. The cover-up is a multi-billion-dollar operation. And I remember thinking, what is a billion? This was 1981. I don't know that I'd ever heard the term billion before. So by now my mind is reeling and I'm thinking, okay, so is this truth ever going to come out? Obviously, it's been covered up for a long time. And when is it going to come out? And he said, well, you need to understand something. Again, 1981. This is a God-fearing country. If the truth were to come out, and by the way, we don't know the full truth, but if what we knew were to come out, it would pull the rug out from under everything. The whole fabric of society would come unraveled. And what I've come to learn is that there is only one thing that keeps everything together. It is the global economy. And if you disrupt people's lives and you disrupt the global economy, then the control structure that the entire world has, all of those world governments have on their populace, will come apart. And then you have chaos. What is the value then of disclosure?
Wow. I wish I'd known this guy when I was writing the disclosure book with Dolan, because I'd have had some questions for him.
Yeah.
Okay. Not to stop you in the middle of this, but for context, I want everyone to understand something. This is an outrageous story that this guy is telling you, and yet true. And this guy, in 1981, when he told it to you, was going into a job in the Navy Department of the Reagan administration. And if he'd been a screw-up, or anybody had thought, this guy talked to Brent Friedman, boy, we got to get rid of him, that didn't happen. In Reagan's second term, he was the Secretary of Energy. And anyone who knows anything about the UFO field says the Navy's all over it, and so is the Energy Department. So This guy had perfect bona fides for telling you this crazy story.
Right.
I now cede the ground back to you, sir.
Well, and here's the interesting thing, whether it's the underground base in West Virginia that he said he was briefed in, the details of which we'll talk about a little bit later, whether it was his connection to the Navy and ultimately then the Department of Energy, all of those details that have been in my story since 1981, I did not know. I did not know anything about ufology at that time. And yet all of those things have come to light as being super important and foundational to the ufology. So I think that when people ask me, you're a writer, how do we know that you didn't come up with this? Well, it's laced with details I just could not have invented. It's beyond my capabilities. I'm just not that good of a writer. Let me conclude how the whole story essentially ended, which was, I said, my mind is reeling. And what I don't understand is you've told me all of this. And how do you know I'm not going to go tell people myself about this? And he said, I'm sure you will. But the question is, who's going to believe you? And that kind of hit me in the solar plexus, like, wow, you're right. Who is going to believe an 18-year-old kid who's going off to UCLA to be a theater major? Secondarily, he said, if you tell this story and you use my name, I'll just deny it, because that's how the cover-up works. And so there I was with this incredible story, and already realizing there was no value to it in terms of me telling anyone and being the whistleblower, right? If that was even crossing my mind. But I have to say that at 18 years old, I remember we'd stayed up late enough talking, and by the time I got downstairs where my friends were asleep down in the rumpus room, I remember laying there on my sleeping bag on the floor, looking up at this window and seeing the stars. And I thought, my whole world has just been turned upside down. And I don't think I fully understood how to process it, but I told that story to my family when I got back home. And I don't think I told it again until probably close to 30, when I was 30, because even my family had trouble believing it.
So basically, when you started telling it again was close to when we met.
I told it to the woman who would become my wife, Patricia, because I was marrying her and I felt she needed to know certain things that had happened in my life. So by me telling her, the fact that she was working for you on Mantis was what prompted her to say, when she saw all your UFO books on your bookshelf, hey, my husband has a really interesting UFO story. You should hear it.
Well, let me just, on the subject of belief, I can't comment on all the details of your story. It certainly has impacted me. And going back to that first time where you told me that story at Ca del Sol in the Italian restaurant, and I heard it, my first reaction, to be honest with you completely, is I thought, I don't know if I buy this. Because it was so detailed and it was so well told, I just thought it's too good to be true. That's what I thought. But, and this is where history gets changed, I said, I don't even care if it's true. This guy is a great storyteller. This is a great story. If we can come up with more stuff like this, we'll have a great TV show, and that's why we started working together. Now, over the years, I have heard this story a couple of other times in different incarnations, and they've always been, and I say this for the people listening, not for you, it has always been consistent. It's never deviated from the story you just heard. And so that's kind of hard to do. People that are making up stuff, they have nothing to hang on to, so they kind of lose their gravity and float off in other directions. But this one's been the same. And I just want to leave us with this one thought, which is recently, and by recently I mean 2023 and 2025, a couple of things have occurred that make this story that you just told even more real and relevant to what's going on today. And if that doesn't keep people around to the next, after the break, I don't know what will, but we'll be back with that story. Well, we're back and we're squarely in the 1980, 1981 time zone where things got a little squirrely in the last act there. Just as a way of just sort of judging how revolutionary this story was. And that's why we brought up Hangar 18, where they're floating these kind of big ideas, but it's in a silly movie. This is very real, what happened to you. At the time you were doing that, by the way, I was a CNN correspondent. And I had an office mate, just so you can sort of, I mean, this has nothing to do with the level of John Herrington telling you this, but my office mate was the entertainment reporter at CNN, a guy named Fred Saxon, a great friend. He's passed on. But Fred, in addition to being Mr. Hollywood, was Mr. UFO. So we sort of bonded. We would close the doors, and talk about UFOs when we were goofing off. And Fred would tell me stories about crashed craft and you can't believe what's really going on. And he would tell me stories that sort of had some of the essence of what you said and some of Hangar 18. But as I heard it from Fred, I thought, this is crazy. Yeah, I think there's UFOs out there, but this other stuff, this seems it's like a bridge too far. So it is kind of interesting. Society has changed what it's willing to think about some of the things that you just said, which were super shocking to me when I heard them in 94 and 95, but they were super, super, super shocking to an 18-year-old in 1981. And all I can tell you is, while I was a CNN correspondent, I did pitch UFOs a couple of times to the assignment editor and then also to somebody in Atlanta. We were in LA. And boy, did I get shut down hard. We're not doing that. And I was, in fact, warned by one person who said, please don't bring this up again, because if you do, it's really going to negatively impact your career here. So actually, the reason I bring that up is that supports what Herrington was telling you.
Absolutely.
Like, who's going to believe you? We've done such a good job of putting the disinformation next to the information. Nobody knows what the hell is going on. And I would say my life at that time is very true. So one thing I did want to ask you, hearing this story again, it makes me just, new questions come up. Here's one I don't think I've asked you. Did you have any contact with John Herrington after this event in 1981?
Ooh, that's a good question. No, not in person, but while we were in production on Dark Skies, I remember one day my assistant came in and said, oh, you got something in the mail, which was weird because who would send mail to the production office for me? But I opened it up and it was one of those buck slips. Remember those kind of like long vertical things? I said, from the desk of John Herrington. And he wrote out in longhand, congratulations on finally getting your story out there. And I thought, wow, I had never considered it because he said, go ahead and tell your story. No one's going to believe you. But clearly he wasn't upset that I was, had Dark Skies on the air and it was inspired by our conversation. But it also made me realize at that time, is it possible that he told me this story as part of the disinformation program? And as hard as it is for me to admit that, because this was a man that I trusted and I respected, I idolized to a certain degree, to think that he would potentially be using me, an 18-year-old kid who's like, I'm nobody, as part of the disinformation campaign. It hurts to even think of that, and I don't believe it, but I have to acknowledge that that is one possible explanation. And I think you've got a story that connects to that about William Moore.
Oh, yes, because that is kind of what was going down. There was a guy in the 80s, a UFO researcher, William Moore, who was considered one of the hot shots. I mean, he was very popular at UFO conventions. He is one of the people who was a co-author of that 1980 book, Incident at Roswell. Is that what it was called? The Roswell Incident. He co-wrote it with Charles Berlitz, and everybody saw that book. I bought it because it was at a grocery store point of purchase, and I saw this little book about Roswell and read it. So this guy was a big deal. And in 1989, William Moore, who, again, big draw. If you saw him at the UFO conference and he was on the list, you'd say, let's go to that 2:00 session. I want to hear him. So he goes to this 1989 session, and what does he do? He gets up there for 2 hours and starts by admitting that he has been working for the people in charge of the cover-up. He's been promoting
Wow.
disinformation.
What year was this?
1989. And he is basically saying, listen, they came to me and made me a deal.
Like JC came to us.
Yeah, like JC came to us. And the deal was, hey, you got to help us with, some of what we're doing, but we'll give you this great access. And his thinking, he said, was that he felt that if they gave him a little bit of access, he could ingratiate his way in there and then get more access and actually get to the truth. So from his point of view, he was doing something almost heroic. I mean, he is getting inside.
Yes.
And let's face it, that is a heavy thing. I mean, I know that when you and I were approached, we both went, where does this go? I mean, is this something we should be a part of? So very intriguing. I always thought two things about the Herrington thing. It made you almost a non-credible witness to do dark skies. So he might not have been totally disappointed, because here's a guy that could say, this is what the guy told me, only now you're out promoting a TV series that's got crazy stuff in it.
Lots of fiction in it.
Lots of fiction in it. And so in a way, that makes anything you say on the topic less credible. The other thing I always thought, and listen, only you can judge this, but my feeling was there may have been no agenda with him other than, there's Brent. He reminds me of another time back when I taught him to play football and things like that. He feels good about you.
Yeah.
Right. And he's under this incredible tension. I mean, I can't even imagine if his story that he told you is a true story, and I believe it is, if he told you that story and it was real, he did it because he probably wasn't telling anybody else. He wasn't telling his wife and his children. He wasn't telling his friends and his coworkers. He wasn't telling anybody at the Navy Department because he was sworn to secrecy.
Right.
And he realized, I can tell Brent something and not have to own it.
Yes.
And the fact that he was drinking a bit, let's face it, that loosens people up a little bit. So I don't know whether it was to pass information to you or to pass disinformation to you, or whether it's more about the human condition, a guy that just said, I don't know what to do with the shit they have put me through.
Right.
And I'm going to tell this kid.
Yeah. Well, I got to tell you, that's the version of the story that I want to believe, right? That he was telling me both maybe as unburdening himself in a way that maybe he didn't tell his wife and daughters. And here was this guy that was like a son in some ways. And also just this notion of, I'm giving you a warning. The world is not the way you think it is, right? One little detail I just realized I left out was, after he had told me all of this, I said to him, wow, I guess I now understand why you cried yourself to sleep every night. And he said, no, Brent, you don't understand. All of this stuff I just told you, that was day 3.
What?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I have to take a second to assimilate that into my thought process here. But he was there for
months.
What else could it have been? I
exactly.
mean, where was he going for the rest of this time?
Exactly. And so I think, look, I know, again,
that's the most profound thing that you've told a really interesting story, but for him to actually say that raises so many relevant and frankly, impossible questions.
Well, but let's go back to something you said a few minutes ago, which I appreciate the candor, which is, you didn't believe the story 100% when you first heard it, right? As most people don't. And that's fine. I get it. I understand. It was a lived experience for me and anyone else. It's just a Hollywood writer telling what could be a really cool story. What I'm curious is, when did you finally believe me?
I'm glad we're getting into this. And I want to make one thing clear. As I got to know you better and heard the story another time or two, I accepted it because I accepted you, right? A lot of journalism, a lot of anything is being able to look at someone who's telling you a story and go, is this person credible? And I always thought, this is a very credible story. I just don't see Brent making this thing up and then wanting to tell it to people, but then also trying to keep it from not being told to people. It just seemed like too much to ask of a story. And I believed you with qualifications. The qualifications being, you know what? Lots of people in life have told a story and then when they tell it again, then they tell it a little better and people give them props for how they told it. And so they do the next one a little better. Yeah. But I never saw that with you. I didn't see you doing that. Okay. There are two great things that we can bring to this podcast that we did not know. You did not know in 1981 for sure. And I and you did not know in 1994 when you told it to me for sure that we know now.
Yes. Let's hear them.
Number one, your man Herrington, where did he say this had happened?
He said in an underground facility in West Virginia.
Okay, guess what? As it turns out, in 1992, when Clinton was president, 2 years before you tell me the story even, okay, Ted Gupp of the Washington Post breaks a story that there is a secret, vast underground facility beneath the Greenbrier Resort, which was built between 1959 and 1962 in West Virginia. Okay. Designed to have Congress stay there, all of Congress, which is 535 people, after a nuclear war. And for 30 years, they stocked it with supplies and never acknowledged it by the government. As soon as, by the way, this story was outed, the government admitted it, and they conduct tours there now. So,
wow.
We could always, maybe we should offer sound, light, and frequency tours to this place. But I find that to be just a profound thing that he mentioned the specificity of West Virginia, something you would not have known at all.
Right.
Because maybe he wouldn't have he knew it because he went there.
Right.
But I mean, it was not a thing.
No, and here's the crazy thing. So it wasn't until even earlier this year when I was telling this story to someone when they were asking about what is this podcast, and I was giving them a little preview, and they asked me a question no one had ever asked before. They said, well, what is this facility in West Virginia? And I thought, wow, there's so many other details in the story that people focus on. The conversation never went to the Greenbrier Resort. And so when you and I started talking about it and we did some research, lo and behold, there's this underground facility that completely matches and holds up with the story that he told. So, okay, that's a very compelling piece of evidence. What else you got?
Well, by the way, I'm just finding the notes here. Obviously, this facility had a name. They codenamed it Project Greek Island, which I find interesting.
Yeah.
And remember, by the way, it's being built at the same time our Dark Skies series starts. Remember, we started in 61 and they were building it between 59 and 62. That's interesting. And is an interesting side thing because the pilot of Dark Skies has a lot to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis early on. Nobody actually went to this place during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I think is interesting because I would have bet they filled the place up with Congress.
Yeah.
That one got so tense. Okay, here's the second one, Brent. And this one makes me feel good for you because it just gives credibility and credit to your story in a way that is pretty solid. Okay. In 2023, and I should tell everyone, we're recording this particular episode of the podcast in my media room here at my house. So you're sitting here in this room, and I wanted to just point out, it was in this room in 2023 on May 8th, I believe, that Dave Grush was here. And Dave Grush got interviewed for the very first time on video because Ross Coulthart, my partner at the time, who you had mentioned, had said that Grush was coming to town, and I'd met with Grush and Ross. And everybody that was at this lunch was concerned, well, if he's going to talk to News Nation tomorrow, he's had no practice whatsoever in talking on camera. let's give him some practice. So
everyone, this was all pre-whistleblower.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's not talked. He talks in July, but this is when Ross is getting set to tell his story. And so everybody said, well, we should put him on camera and give him a practice session, which is what happened here at this house in this room where you're sitting right now.
Okay.
Dave Grush sat there. In between, because people were working on lights and microphones and all that stuff, I asked Grush if he had ever heard of the name John Herrington. And Dave Grush, who, again, was the guy that raised his hand before Congress in July of 23 and promised to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help him God, Dave Grush looks at me and goes, yeah, I've heard of Herrington. And I said, well, what do you know about him? And he said, well, I'm really, I don't know if you use the word at liberty, that might be too, but that's what I felt.
Right.
I think he said something like, I really can't talk about that. Okay. All right. Well, he knows the guy, but he can't talk about him. Very interesting. But here's where it gets fascinating. This year, it's 2025. This year, I get first a message and then a call from Ross Coulthard. And I believe I can say this because, he didn't swear me to secrecy. It was he was calling me to ask me something. He said that Grush, who was now working for one of the Congressional congressmen, what's his name that he works for? One of the guys who's on the committee.
Remember, yeah.
But people will look it up. Grush works for him, and I believe still does. And Ross wanted to know because Grush had asked him, I think he wanted my phone number or whatever. And Ross said, you know what? Let me ask him. What do you want me to ask him? And what Ross asked me was, do you think Brent, your friend Brent, would get in a car and drive John Herrington to Washington, D.C. to testify? I almost fell off my chair when I heard that.
Yeah.
And I also found the irony, which I'm sure you can find, which as an 18-year-old, you drove a car across America to D.C., right, to get your briefing. And now, all these years later, they want you to drive the man who gave you the briefing to Washington, D.C., so he can give another briefing to Congress. Okay, that's interesting enough. I said, I don't think Brent's probably going to go along with that, but I'll ask him. It wasn't untoward for Ross to ask for that. Of course, that's reasonable. But then he said, well, what do you think his reaction would be if he was subpoenaed? And I don't think he was talking about Grush. I think he was talking about you at that moment.
Yeah.
I'm not Grush, Herrington, but I think he was talking about you. Anyway, I look at these two things, the West Virginia thing and the Grush angle, and I say, while that's not smoking gun level, that's not finding a trove of UFO documents in his briefcase that was locked away, it's still pretty good.
Yeah, well, I have to tell you, when you called me about that Ross conversation and the word subpoena was tossed out, I started to feel queasy at the thought of it. The thing is, I have no problem going under oath, right? But at that point, we had already decided we were going to do this podcast. And I thought, if I'm going to tell my stories, honestly, I want them to be under my terms, right? For us, right? Not with congressional investigators peppering me with things and making me look like an idiot, right? Which I can pretty much guarantee would happen. And I thought, I want to tell this story. I want to tell a bunch of stories because at the end of the day, this Herrington story is effectively the backstory, right, of Sound, Light, and Frequency.
Right.
But there's much more to Sound, Light, and Frequency than even just this story. And I think, as a for instance, we've got a bunch of stories about how the next meeting with JC plays out and what happened with the deal. And there are other things downstream that paint a much bigger picture here than just what happened in 1981. A seminal event for me, and granted the inspiration for Dark Skies.
I know it's a challenge to have to lay all this out. And I also appreciate the impetus that you shared with us about why you did it. And I think people are probably very appreciative that you did. And here's all I'll say to you right now. Thank you. But also you ask, well, when did I start believing, or what do I believe this story 100%. I won't say 110 or 1,000% because those don't count, but I believe 100%. I've heard it. I've looked into it. I've had these things occur. The John Herrington story passes for me. And so, again, on behalf of everybody who's listening and people who will hear this in the future, thank you very much. Sound, Light, and Frequency is an iHeart podcast produced by Stellar Productions. It's executive produced by Nick Johnson, and for Stellar, Jackie Zabel. Our show's music was written by Anna Stumpf and Hamilton Lighthouser. And your hosts and executive producers are Bryce Zabel, that's me, and Brent Friedman. Watch the skies.